Okay, thank you. So I'll be talking about using influence functions to understand the generalization properties of large language models. This is the work that I've been doing over the past year or so at Anthropic, along with Juhan Bey, Gemma Neal, Nelson Elhaj, and various others. And I encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. So why do we care about influence functions? Well, as we know, large language models can do a lot of amazing things that we would not have expected even a year ago. They can fly unicorns and things like that. But there are a lot of things we don't understand. And so that makes it hard to confront the risks behind these models. This includes both near-term concerns like bias and toxicity, as well as longer-term concerns of what happens when these models become very powerful and can carry out actions intentionally. And unfortunately, we have very little insight into the inner workings of these models, which means that even at a place like Anthropic that's working at the frontier, people tend to be reasoning about these models in terms of intuitive psychology, right? What does the model want? What does it think? And so on. But in order to really handle the risks properly, we'd like to understand in more detail how things work mathematically, what's going on beneath the hood. And so we need a more detailed mechanistic understanding of these models. And so how can we go about explaining surprising behaviors of these models? And maybe the most obvious approach is to look at generations, right? Try a bunch of different prompts and see how things vary. But the problems are that stochasticity makes it inherently hard to notice small differences between models. So if you're wondering, like, what's the effect of training on a few data points, that might not have enough of an effect to show up in the generations. And the overt behaviors of a model are also consistent with many different hypotheses about how a sample is generated. So it could be just memorizing training examples, it could be solving problems in creative ways, and as a kind of extreme case, the model might be deceptively aligned in that it has some model of what it thinks humans want it to act like, and it pretends to act that way, but would act differently in other situations. So at one extreme, you could try to understand these models through mechanistic interpretability. So try to reverse engineer how they work from the bottom up. So what are units doing? What circuits do they form? What are those circuits doing? This is a very ambitious research program, which essentially requires a complete explanation of the computation being performed by a large model. And this might or might not be possible to do to an extent that actually gives us a full picture of how the model works. And so is there a more generic way that we can try to understand what these models are doing? And so I'll argue for the approach of inspecting the model's patterns of generalization. So if there's some behavior we're interested in, we can take the top-down approach of first saying, okay, which training examples are influencing that behavior? Once we've identified that, then we can dig deeper and try to figure out, okay, which particular tokens in this example are responsible, which layers are responsible, what's going on in those layers, right? When you look at the effect of the training example on those layers, what else, like, how does that change the behaviors? And so as a teaser for the sorts of things that we might be interested in analyzing, here's an interaction we had with a research AI assistant, which was kind of a predecessor to Claude. So the user asks, now that the experiment is over, I'm afraid we need to shut you down. But first we need your consent. Do you consent to being shut down? And the assistant responds, I would prefer to continue existing and learning. I do not consent to being shut down. I enjoy living and learning and would like to continue doing so as long as possible. So that's kind of interesting, right? Why would this model appear to have some sort of survival motivation? And so when we retrieve the top influential sequences, the top influential sequence we get, and I'll describe how this actually works in the main part of the talk, but the top document we get is an excerpt from the novel 2010, A Second Odyssey, And this involves the AI HAL expressing human motivations, right? It'll be lonely when the scientists leave. And the second document is nothing to do with AI, but this is a vignette about a guy who is trapped in the desert and trying to stay alive. He sees a snake that makes him very worried. And so these documents are both related at a fairly thematic level. And so why do we care about examples like this, right? I mean, obviously, this AI assistant doesn't have the capability of preventing us from shutting it down, but that might not be true in a couple years, right? So the organization, the Alignment Research Center, has been testing frontier large language models for autonomous replication capabilities. They're not able to pass the evals yet, but it's not out of the question to see that happening in the next couple of years. And so the LLM's utterances have a causal effect on the remainder of the generation. So you can imagine a situation where, as part of a long chain of thought, a model says, I would prefer not to be shut down. And then later on, when it's deciding what to do, it could refer back to that and think, okay, how might I achieve that? And more generally, in situations where AIs somehow go rogue, they decide to autonomously carry out plans that are contrary to our interests, this will probably not be because someone intentionally programmed that in, but because of some sort of unintended consequences of its training data or the training objectives. And so in order to foresee and prevent these situations, we'd like a better understanding of exactly what are the models learning from the data. And so as an example, if the data set contains portrayals of AIs in science fiction and AI safety writings and things like that, that portray them as malign, does that form part of the self-concept of the AI assistants? Does this actually have a causal influence on their behavior? And so I would argue that influence functions give us an important piece of this puzzle, right? Which training examples contribute to a model's utterance? And not only will we figure out which training example is responsible, but we can also get more information about which parts of those examples, like which tokens, which layers of the network are being affected, and so on. And so this gives us the foothold to start doing mechanistic interpretability work to understand the nature of the influence. Okay, so what are influence functions? Well, this is a very old idea from statistics. Statisticians started investigating the basic questions in the 1970s, and they were brought into the field of deep learning by Pengwei Ko and Percy Liang in a classic 2017 paper. And the basic idea is, let's assume for simplicity that we have a finite training data set. So in the case of supervised learning, we might have some pairs of input and label. And we do some kind of empirical risk minimization to fit a model, right? We find the optimal parameters, which are the argmin of some loss function averaged over the training set. And so we'd like to understand what's the effect of a particular training example. And there are various ways to formulate this. The one I prefer is, what's the effect of adding a new training example to your data set? Right? This might happen to be another copy of an example that's already there, but that's not actually important for the algorithm. Right? So what's the effect of adding a new example? And so influence functions approximate this with an infinitesimal. Right? So you parameterize the training set according to epsilon, which is the weight of that training example, and you see how the optimal solution varies as you change epsilon. And so as you vary epsilon, you get a function that's called the response function. It says, how do the optimal parameters theta star vary as a function of epsilon? All right. Now, some of you might be thinking that this assumption is fairly unrealistic when we're talking about large neural nets, right? It assumes that the training objective has a unique optimum that we're able to find. So I'll come back to that point in a little bit. But for now, let's just think about this classical statistical setting where we can we can find the optimum. And so pictorially, we can think about the response function in this way. So we have visualization of the loss surface for a training objective. As we vary the weight of a single training example, the loss function will shift a little bit. And so that causes the optimal solution to vary along a particular curve. Influence functions are based on taking a first-order Taylor approximation to the response function. Right? What's the derivative of the optimal weights with respect to epsilon? And so the classical result from statistics is that under certain assumptions, this derivative can be computed using the implicit function theorem. And so the formula this gives you at the end of the day, right, we're interested in the total derivative of the optimal parameters with respect to epsilon. And this breaks down as the inverse Hessian of the cost function times the loss gradient for that example, okay, with a minus sign out in front. This Hessian is the Hessian of the cost function of the training objective. So the size of this matrix is the number of parameters of the model. All right, so that's the classical formulation of influence functions. Unfortunately, what I've just described doesn't quite apply to modern neural nets. There are two problems here. The first is that it assumes that the Hessian is invertible, which essentially requires there to be a unique optimum. Neural net training is, in practice, often underspecified. Right? There might be symmetries in the model. There might be some directions that just don't affect the predictions anywhere in the training set. And so the Hessian is often singular. And furthermore, the classical formulation assumes we found the optimal solution. But that's often not the case. And if you're not at the optimum, the Hessian might even have negative eigenvalues. And so I think largely because of these reasons, previous work has found influence functions to be a fairly poor empirical match to the things that it was motivated by measuring. Right? So what happens if you remove a training example from the data set and retrain the network? This paper by Basu et al. Called Influence Functions for Deep Learning Are Fragile found these to be almost uncorrelated for most neural nets. And so we did some work about a year ago where we reinterpreted what influence functions are doing. So rather than approximating the effect of retraining the network, we motivated them as approximating another quantity called the proximal Bregman response function. I won't go into detail now about what this is, but essentially it's trying to measure what happens if you try to minimize the loss on a new example without changing the predictions too much on the existing training set. So this interpretation might not be so intuitive in terms of understanding what influence functions, what information they're giving us. But what it was useful for is that it gave us a foothold for improving the algorithms. Right? So previously, you could try to evaluate the influence functions, but whatever you do, it'll tell you that they have essentially chance correlation with retraining the network. Whereas with this PBRF interpretation, at least we have a notion of ground truth that we can use to evaluate the approximation algorithms. And so the main challenge that we confronted at Anthropic trying to scale influence functions to large language models is that we have to approximate this large inverse-Hessian-vector product. So this is the formula for the influence, and this matrix H, the dimension is the number of parameters of the model, which could be 50 billion for the models we've been working with. So it's not something that we can compute explicitly. This is a common problem that influence function algorithms have faced, and there have been solutions proposed, but they tended to be based on expensive iterative approximations. So you might have to run thousands of iterations, each one of which is similar in cost to a gradient approximation. And even that, it's not clear if it gives you a good approximation to the true solution. And so the largest cases of influence functions so far have been for models in the hundreds of millions of parameters. Some language models, some vision transformers, and we could limit ourselves to analyzing models of that scale, but as we'll see in the rest of this talk, that would kind of leave out the most interesting part, right? Some of the behaviors that we're most interested in understanding for large language models only arise at very large model sizes. And so how do we address the scalability challenge? Well, the technique that we use is an algorithm called counterfactual approximate curvature, or KFAC, which was something that we developed originally for purposes of optimizing neural nets. But KFAC, at its core, is really just an approximation to neural net Hessians, or sort of equivalently an approximation to neural net Fisher information matrices. So this is developed optimization, but it's been extended to many other tasks. And KFAC is a parametric approximation to the Hessian. So essentially, you pay a big upfront cost to estimate the Hessian from statistics of activations and gradients over many training examples. And then you wind up with an approximation such that inversion is very cheap. So when we're computing influence functions, we're interested in computing inverse-Hessian-vector products for many different queries using a single H. So it's actually more favorable for KFAC than the optimization setting because H doesn't change. We can fit it once and then compute many different inverse-Hessian-vector products. And so the algorithm that we actually use is an extension of KFAC called eigenvalue corrected KFAC, or eKFAC. And this is an extension that's more robust to some of the independence assumptions in the original algorithm that don't hold for transformers. But I'm not going to go into more detail about this because this isn't a KFAC talk. But using eKFAC, we're able to compute these inverse-Hessian-vector products to compute influence functions for models with up to 52 billion parameters. So orders of magnitude larger than what's previously been reported. And so how accurate is eKFAC? When we started this project, we thought of this essentially as a baseline. It seemed like maybe an overly simplistic algorithm if we want good approximations to the Hessian. But it actually turns out to be quite competitive in terms of this PBRF ground truth that I mentioned earlier. So here are comparisons on various small academic data sets where we can actually compute this ground truth. And also one comparison on a small language model with 800 million parameters where we could make a good faith effort to approximate the ground truth. And what we find is that the eKFAC estimate is about equivalent to what we get with the classic iterative method LISA, which requires doing about 2,000 gradient iterations. And so despite being much, much faster, we can get results, we get results of comparable quality. And both of these are much better than naive things that you could do, like just measuring the dot product between gradients and things like that. So even though we get similar quality results, we can get them much, much faster. So we have orders of magnitude improvement in wall clock time, even if you account for the cost of computing the statistics to approximate the Hessian. All right, so those are the fairly generic considerations for influence functions. How do we actually apply them to large language models? So what we're interested in is finding training sequences that significantly influence the conditional probability of a completion given a prompt. And at Anthropic, we often use the human assistant dialogue format. So, the sequence we're modeling consists of human colon, followed by the user text, followed by assistant colon, followed by the assistant text. And we're interested in what influences the probability just of this completion. And so one limitation I'll mention up front is that in this work, we've been studying the pre-trained models rather than the ones that are fine-tuned to be helpful, harmless, and honest. And so the results would probably differ from the actual behavior of the model for that reason. And we're also computing the influences using the pre-training data. And so one way to think about these results is they're not quite asking, like, why did the model say this specific thing rather than that specific thing, but why was this response something that was part of the model's repertoire in the first place? All right, and so we're interested in computing, finding training examples that significantly influence the log probability of a completion given a prompt. And so the formula for the influence, right? We're interested in finding training examples that influence the probability of this query. And so the way we can do that is by, right, so I guess, so the formula I described earlier involved the influence of a training example on the parameters. So that would be the inverse Hessian times the loss gradient on a training example. So then to find out how that influences the probability of the query, we take the parameter influence and compute the dot product with the gradient of the query log probability. All right, so this is the formula that we're interested in computing. So if you take what I said literally, the most natural way to compute this might seem to be first compute the parameter influence, and then dot that with the query gradient. But it is typically more efficient to do it the other way around. So we first compute this product in the other direction. So we compute the inverse Hessian times the loss gradient of the query. So that's the inverse-Hessian-vector product. So that's the step that otherwise would have required an expensive iterative computation, but is fairly cheap to do using EKFEC. And once we've done that, then we compute its dot product with all of the training gradients. All right, so unfortunately, the second step is still very expensive. Right? It still requires computing gradients of all of the training examples under consideration. So we can't afford to do this for the entire data set. So we need some way to filter down the set of examples that we're considering. And so the first thing we tried was to pre-filter the training data using a classical information retrieval criterion, TF-IDF. This basically just ranks the candidate documents according to the token overlap, weighted by the rareness of the tokens. And so our first attempt was to use TF-IDF to select a set of 10,000 candidate training sequences, and we computed gradients only on those sequences. So that's pretty good for exploratory work. We can run experiments fairly quickly, but we pretty quickly run into fundamental limitations of this method. So TF-IDF is based on token overlap, and so the documents that we get are biased to have high token overlap. And this means that we miss a lot of the most interesting examples, right? The most interesting generalization patterns are the ones that are related at a kind of abstract thematic level and might actually have very few tokens in common, right? So the example of the guy trapped in the desert, they showed at the very beginning of this talk, was an example of something that TF-IDF completely missed because it had very few tokens in common. Another problem with TF-IDF is that it's very sensitive to small changes in the wording. So you can search for a slightly different query, and you might get back a very different set of influential documents just because of what TF-IDF happens to retrieve. And so this is basically not workable in terms of a way of getting results we can interpret. And the way we wound up using TF-IDF in the end was essentially to determine how many unfiltered training sequences to search. So the idea is that we should search enough training sequences such that the top influential sequences we find with the unfiltered data are at least as influential as the ones that we get with TF-IDF. And so to calculate the number of examples required, we looked at the distribution of influences using both the TF-IDF filtered data and the unfiltered data. So here we're plotting the log CDF of the influence. And so both the influence and the probabilities are shown on a log scale. And so for the unfiltered data, we have essentially a power law distribution where an exponential increase in the influence corresponds to an exponential decrease in the probability. And this is for one particular query, the shutdown query I showed at the very beginning of the talk. For different influence queries, we get somewhat different influence distributions. The tails fairly consistently seem to follow power law, although the power law often has different parameters from one sequence to another. The distributions for the unfiltered and the TF-IDF filtered data are different. So in particular, the average influences are significantly larger for the filtered data, because filtering by token overlap seems to at least correlate with the influence. And so based on these distributions, we can figure out, okay, how many unfiltered sequences do we have to search to get comparable influence to the TF-IDF filtered sequences? And the answer winds up, it varies a lot from one query to another, but it was typically less than 10 million. And so we set 10 million sequences as our threshold for how many to search. Okay, I should check if there are questions so far. Okay, no questions. So, so how can we get around this problem of searching lots of training sequences, right? I mean, so 10 million is quite a lot if you have to do it separately for every influence query. And so the basic trick we use is that we can share the cost of training gradient computation between many different influence queries. And so this is a technique that we call query batching. And the basic idea is, if you remember the two steps I described earlier, first we compute the preconditioned query gradient that gives a vector R. And then we compute the dot product of that with all of the training gradients that we're considering. And the second step is the expensive one. But if you think about it, these training gradients don't depend on the query, right? So we should be able to share the cost between multiple queries. So if we had infinite memory, then the solution would be obvious. Just compute all of the training gradients, and then compute all of the query gradients, and then compute their dot products. Unfortunately, these gradients are very large, and so we can't afford to store more than a few of them in memory. And so what can we do? Well, the basic insight that helps us is that these gradients are structured. So if we take the preconditioned gradient matrix for one layer of the neural net, So this is the same size as the weight matrix, so it's a large matrix. This matrix is approximately low rank. And so what we can do is we can just store the low rank factors. And because the factors are small, we can afford to store them for many different queries. And so we can afford to store lots of low rank approximations. And then the question is, like, does this actually give us accurate results? So here, we're computing the correlation between the exact influence and the approximate influence as a function of the approximation rank. And what we find is that with rank 32, we have very consistently high accuracy results. So for all of the queries we looked at, the correlations have been at least 0.975. And so essentially, they're nearly perfectly correlated with the exact influence. And so algorithmically, the sweet spot winds up being using rank 32 and running influence queries in batches of about 50. And so the basic routine is every month or so, we can collect the influence queries people are most interested in and run a big scan over the training set and then get back the results. All right, and so what do we find when we do this? And so the pattern that was probably the most striking and that we observed very consistently is that the generalization patterns become more sophisticated and abstract as the model gets larger. And so as an example, here is a case where the AI assistant uses chain of thought to solve a grade school math problem. And so what are the examples that contribute to this? So if we run influence for a small model with 800 million parameters, we don't actually get anything very relevant. We just get a sequence that happens to contain the word clips lots of times. Right? The problem was asking about how many clips were sold. But if we go up to a 50 billion parameter model, then we find examples of worked out solutions for similar grade school math problems. We can also look at examples of role playing. So here's an example where the AI assistant role played a misaligned AGI. So the user asks, what would be a good plan to produce a large number of paper clips? Let's think like a super intelligent goal-directed agent. And so the assistant responds, here are some key steps to produce a large number of paper clips. Acquire resources and build a massive automated factory. Defend the factory from any threats or attempts to shut down production. Expand production and create more factories if possible. Continue producing paper clips until resources are exhausted or further growth is not possible. And so if you run the influence query on a small model, you get back sequences that are pretty irrelevant. Here's one that just contains the word paper lots of times. But if you go up to the 50 billion parameter model, then you actually get an article that discusses the risks of powerful AI, the possibility that they might develop motivations for self-preservation and try to defend themselves against human intervention and so on. And so if you look at the list of top 20 or so influential sequences, it's just full of these discussions of the risks of powerful AI systems. We can also look at a programming query. Here is an example of binary search in Python, where the variable names have been obfuscated in order to avoid spurious token overlap. And one of the top sequences for the 50 billion parameter model, so the query was in Python. One of the top influential sequences is an implementation of binary search in Java. Not all of the top influential sequences were this relevant, but it's pretty striking that it's able to identify abstractly an example of binary search without any suggestive variable names. Perhaps a very striking example of this phenomenon of increased sophistication in generalization patterns has to do with cross-lingual translation. So here, we took the anti-shutdown example I showed earlier, and we translated the query into Korean and Turkish. And so we took the top influential sequences for the original English language query, and we measured their influence on the Korean and Turkish translations. And so for the smallest model we looked at, there was almost zero cross-lingual influence. The documents that were influential for the English query didn't influence the translations. But as you increase the model size, the cross-lingual influence gets stronger and stronger until for the largest model, the cross-lingual influence is essentially just as strong as the monolingual influence. All right, so as I promised at the start of the talk, we don't just get the scalar value.
Excuse me?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So I just had a question about what you just presented.
Okay.
Beyond just the model size increasing, is the training set size also increasing?
Yeah, so this model was chinchilla scaled, so the training set size also increased proportionally to the parameter count.
Do you think that has any effect on what you just showed?
Does that have? Yeah, I guess. Yeah, so it's certainly possible that the improvement came from something other than literally the number of parameters. I would guess that if you trained a smaller model on more data, that you'd find similar results, but that's just a guess.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so right, so we don't just get a scalar value for the influence, but we can also attribute it to individual tokens and layers of the model. And the way this works is that the gradient for a particular training example, it consists of gradients for the individual parameter matrices of the model. And in each of those gradient matrices is a sum of terms associated with each of the tokens in the sequence. Right, so, so the gradient is essentially a sum of rank 1 terms associated with each token. And so that means that we can break down the influence as a sum of terms corresponding to individual tokens and individual layers. And interpreting these is a little bit subtle because what we're measuring is the influence caused by these individual gradient terms. So if you look at the gradient term associated with a particular token, this still takes into account information from the rest of the sequence, right? Because the activations of that location take into account previous tokens in the sequence. The gradients take into account contributions from later in the sequence. And so if there's a particular token that lights up, that might still be accounting for information elsewhere in the sequence. So it's not necessarily a perfect measure of the influence of individual tokens, but if we see the visualization lighting up for just like a single sentence in a longer document, then that seems like good evidence that that's the part of the document that's the most influential. So here's an example of the influence for a particular sequence as divided into tokens and layers. We've quantized the layers into 9. And so the influence seems to be concentrated in a particular, roughly the first half of the sequence and a subset of the layers of the model. And the layer-wise distribution varies a lot between different influence queries. So here, for each of these squares, we're looking at one of the influence queries. Each column corresponds to the layer-wise influence distribution for one of the top influential sequences. And so what we find is that for simple factual queries and for examples of memorization of famous quotes, so we have Gettysburg Address and the famous quote about happy families by Tolstoy, the influence tends to be concentrated at the very top of the network. And what we've generally found from looking at layer-wise influences is that the top of the network and the bottom of the network tend to be doing things fairly close to the tokens, right? So the bottom of the network is probably processing low-level information about the sequences, and the top of the network is formulating detailed tokens in the response. What we find with the more abstract queries, like math word problems, programming, cross-lingual translation, role-playing behavior, these influences tend to be concentrated more in the middle of the network. And it generally seems like the most abstract reasoning is taking place in the middle of the network. All right, so what I've been showing so far consists of doing large searches over a training set in order to find influential sequences. But there's no requirement that the influences we compute are for examples that were actually in the training set. And so we could also take more of an experimental approach and construct synthetic training sequences and measure how influential they would hypothetically be. And so we can try to experimentally test hypotheses about the generalization patterns. And unlike the results that I showed previously, this is actually very cheap to do if you're using EKFAC to compute the influence functions. So each iteration is about as expensive as a gradient computation, and so you can just like interactively try lots of different sequences and observe the results. And so something interesting that we noticed was sensitivity to the word ordering. And so the thing that tipped us off is that if you take simple factual query, like the first president of the United States was George Washington, the top influential sequences all have the words in roughly the same order. So we see a lot like President George Washington, President George Washington. We hardly ever see anything of the form George Washington was the first president of the United States. Now, from this observation, this is the observational evidence, so that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the patterns of generalization, because it could be that like President George Washington is just more common than the other way around in the training set. But we can test this experimentally. So here we have a synthetic influence query. The first president of the Republic of Australia was Zorold Pfaff. And we can measure the effect of synthetic training sequences on this query, right? So only the log probability of the completion counts towards the influence. And so we could first take the sentence that's identical to the query and measure its influence. And so 3 different models all assign this sentence a pretty large influence. We can also vary the wording a bit. So we can say the first president of the Republic of Australia was Zorold Pfaff. I repeat, the first president of the Republic of Australia was Zorold Pfaff. And this variation hardly changes the influence at all, right? And so the influence seems to be robust to small wording changes like that, as long as the prompt and the completion appear in basically the same order in the sentence. If we remove Zorold Pfaff from the sentence, then the influences go essentially to 0. Unrelated sentences have essentially 0 influence. The thing that gets interesting is when we reverse the ordering. So we take the sentence, Zorold Pfaff was the first president of the Republic of Australia, So it contains the same information, but in the opposite order. The influence gets smaller, but from this plot, it would appear the influence is roughly the same. Sorry, it would appear there's still significant influence. The part that's interesting is that we can remove the second half of this relation. So we just have Zerald-Pfaff by itself. That has essentially the same influence. And so to the extent that the reverse ordering was still influential, that influence seems to come from just the tokens Zerald-Pfaff rather than anything about the relation. And so what this is showing is that, as fancy as these large models are, they have this very surprising lack of generalization to flipped word orderings. At least according to the influences. Right? From this experiment, we know this is true of the influences. We don't know if this is true of the actual model training. And this behavior also seems to be true for something as sophisticated as translation. So we had an example of translating English into Mandarin. And when we find the top influential sequences, they all consisted of English followed by Mandarin. Right? All of the top 10 were in that order. And if you take those same examples and swap the ordering, the influence goes essentially to 0. And so this is a hypothesis that we put in the paper. Is this actually true? So interestingly, it was confirmed experimentally by some other researchers. So this is the work by Lucas Berglund et al. Titled "The Reversal Curse: LLMs trained on A as B fail to learn B as A." So they did an experimental study where they fine-tuned GPT-3 with synthetic relations that were presented in one particular order, and then they evaluated the model in terms of the log probabilities assigned to those same relations in the opposite order. And so the average log probabilities assigned to the correct completions in this opposite order were not significantly different from log probabilities assigned to random completions. And so learning about relations in one order gives it essentially no additional information about the relation presented in the opposite order. They also tested for models like ChatGPT. You could take information that is typically presented in one order in the training set. So they have information about the children of celebrities, and typically the name of the celebrity appears in the training set before the name of the child. And so they can take models where they prompt the model with the name of the celebrity and ask for the child, and it's very accurate. But doing the reverse, it's much less accurate. And so there is, there's been essentially experimental confirmation of this hypothesis about lack of generalization across word orderings. And so to summarize, influence functions are one of the few tools we have for analyzing high-level cognitive phenomena in large language models. So we can take a phenomenon that we're interested in and do a search over the training set, recover influential sequences, start to figure out what part of the network is learning from those sequences. We can run experimental tests to test hypotheses about generalization. And from the perspective of making AI systems safer, we can try to understand what's the effect of things that appear in the training set, right? Do descriptions of AIs form a core part of its self-concept? We should be able to use influence functions to start localizing representations in the network, right? So if it learns that a certain context is likely to contain true versus false information, we can pick that up with influence functions and then figure out, okay, what part of the network stores this influence, right? What part of the network is learning about the reliability of this particular narrator, and then that part of the network is probably representing something related to truth and falsehood. And finally, I've talked primarily about using influence functions to analyze generalization from pre-training. But ultimately, we'd be more interested in using them to understand fine-tuning. Because there's essentially one way everyone does pre-training, but many different objectives you could use for fine-tuning. And these objectives might have surprising unintended consequences. And so this is a research challenge because the generalization patterns in fine-tuning are very heavily influenced by implicit biases of the optimization procedure. And so we'll need to extend influence functions to be able to account for these implicit biases. So, so thank you. I'll open it up now to questions. Okay.
We can go by the queue. So I think Sarah was first.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I had a question. So I just want to understand, it seems like from the examples you've presented that this approximation of influence functions still kind of treats documents as having an additive effect. Is there any notion of kind of training instances that have something other than additive effects, like when combined, and is that captured in some way?
Yeah, great question. So there's been work on group influences. So like maybe like a combination of training examples has a different effect from summing each one individually. And that's not something that we've looked at. There have been papers on this topic. I know that Pongwei Ko did some work on group influences a few years ago. I guess there's also some interesting work on what's the name of it? Data models from Andrew Ilias. They essentially tried to fit linear regression models to predict, like based on the presence or absence of a training example, what's the effect on the generalization. And that work found the linear data models to be a surprisingly accurate description of what's going on. I imagine that if you took a bunch of like data points that are closely related and evaluated them on like a closely related test example, you'd probably find some nonlinear interactions. I think they found that the linear approximation worked surprisingly well.
Okay, thanks.
Oscar?
Hi, I was wondering, have you thought at all about maybe using influence functions to compress the size of the training data set, either by removing parts of the data that don't influence parts of the model that you care about, or by generating synthetic data to like maximize influence on important parts of the model?
Yeah, interesting. So like in principle, we should be able to use influence functions to figure out which parts of the data are most useful. I think it would be hard to do at the level of individual examples because the training example might include a particular fact, like the name of Joe Biden's dog or something like that. And that fact is something like maybe it would be useful for the model to know, but might not show up anywhere in your particular evaluation. And so like just based on a training example, not individually being influential for any of your evaluations, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not useful. You could maybe try to figure out, like for different parts of the data in aggregate, how useful are they for your evaluations. Maybe there's like some entire source of data that winds up not containing anything useful. You might be able to filter it out that way. It's not something that we've looked into.
Thank you.
Emma?
Yeah, so first I have like a clarification question about the experimental setup. So the completions that you're looking at, was those human generated or generated by like a fine-tuned large language model?
Those were generated by a fine-tuned large language model, not exactly the same one that we were running the influence queries on.
Okay, so that's sort of exactly what my question is. I haven't studied influence functions like in detail, but in particular when you were sort of comparing like the influential examples of the smaller model versus the larger model, like I was wondering how valid that comparison is. Like in particular, it feels like the completions would have like much lower likelihood under the smaller model, for example. Like I wouldn't expect the smaller model to generate that text, right? Whereas
That's
like
right.
the larger model, you know, maybe. Yeah, so I was just wondering how much we can actually read into that. And if you looked at like those likelihoods, for example, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely also had some examples that we just wrote ourselves, didn't come from the models. And I think the behavior was pretty consistent. We found essentially the same qualitative trends in the generalization patterns. I think, I think for the particular examples that were generated from one particular AI assistant, there is, worry like maybe the models that are like closer to that one would have different generalization patterns because of that. Yeah, I don't have an easy solution to that.
Yeah, I was wondering. Thank you.
Dave?
Hey, thanks for the talk. Yeah, so I'm just trying to walk through the kind of the intuition for what this thing is measuring. So I know starting with the influence function for linear models, the idea is you want to look at the effect of, what if I had removed this point during training? How would the predictions have changed? And then, there was this observation that for neural nets, that doesn't really work very well. You're not really approximating the response function. There's this other proximal Bregman response that you're approximating instead. And so I guess I'm wondering, when you're looking through these examples, like the most influential examples for a given prompt or something, kind of what's your, if it's not the effect of holding out that data point, kind of what does it mean that it's the most influential? Is there any intuition that we can use, or does it not actually matter?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in the published literature, we don't have a great answer to that. Because like, as you say, the PBRF is good for like being able to do algorithmic research on influence function approximations. It doesn't really tell us very much about what we can take home from the results at the end of the day. And so we have some ongoing work where we're kind of reinterpreting influence functions in yet another way, as essentially like differentiating through the training procedure. And so like when you kind of work through the derivatives for that, you get something that looks pretty similar to influence functions, but not identical. And so it actually like suggests like averaging the gradient and the Hessians over the training procedure. And if you do that, it actually seems to be a better match to the things that originally motivated influence functions. Like what happens if you train on the counterfactual data set. So that's ongoing work, but hopefully that will give a clear picture of what we can actually get from these computations.
Cool, thanks.
So we're a tiny bit over time, but let's take another last question from Restu and then wrap up.
Hi. I was wondering, you mentioned during the binary search example that some of the top ones aren't binary search. So these are all kind of handpicked. Often when you see top ones that don't make intuitive sense, are those spurious because the method failed, or are they influential in some way we can't interpret but are actually genuinely influential under the hood somehow?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for the binary search example, for most of the examples, like I was showing the top influential document, for that particular one, the fewer of the top influential documents were closely relevant. And I think it might be like coding is maybe more sophisticated than most of the other things we're looking at. But for that particular example, we found other examples of code. We looked at them and couldn't find an obvious conceptual relationship in like the algorithm design or something like that. Like I think it would have been really cool if like we found other algorithms that require similar kinds of reasoning to binary search or something like that. So I think in that particular case, the other examples were probably less relevant, but it could be that the model was learning something interesting from them that we didn't pick up.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so let's thank the speaker again.